Welcome to Real Business of Wine session on independence in the UK, but not just the UK. What we're looking at is the whole business of how do you retail wine and indeed possibly wholesale wine at the smaller level in a world that's full of big distributors and big supermarkets and big brands and so on. How do you actually make it work? So we've got a pre-recorded session that we did with Graham Holter earlier today, who has the Wine Merchant magazine, in which he talks on a daily basis with around 900 UK independents, which is 920 odd is the right number for serious independent retailers in wine in the UK. People might expect that to be a bit bigger. And he's going to look also at how those businesses have actually reacted to the whole pandemic and the shutdown, lockdown over the last few weeks. And we've also got Mike Boyne, who is down in Padstow, which is a place that if you don't know the UK, or you don't know the Southwest UK, has been made famous by Rick Stein on countless TV programs. Rick Stein, the fish chef, with his restaurant down there, which has become a pilgrimage, a center of pilgrimage for people who want to eat great food. But there are a number of other restaurants down there and all sorts of other businesses. And one of the businesses down there, which is also a place where you can actually stop and actually have a glass of something, is Mike Boyne's Bin 2. And Mike came to being a wine retailer down an interesting route, which involved the armed forces and all sorts of things, which we'll talk about. But I think the important thing that we're going to talk about is really how Bin 2, which has been a multi-award winning retailer, in fact, winning the top independent wine retailer of the year in the Harper's judging, how it has set itself apart and how it competes. And Mike and his team, and I think the team's getting important, compete with the fact that there are supermarkets all around and there are one or two retail chains. So, Graham, we haven't seen each other for ages, and it's good to actually catch up. Tell me a little bit about the Wine Merchant as a magazine, because it is only, it's print and it's online, and it is only really aimed at independent wine retailers in the UK. Is that right?
That's right. We've got a very discreet and very kind of small audience in a way, but it's an audience that's been growing for the last 8 years since the magazine has existed. So when we started, there were fewer than 700 of them, and now we're up to 928 shops. And I think that number is going to continue to rise. Last year, it plateaued a little bit. There were all kinds of issues to do with Brexit and what have you, which affected growth. But in terms of store numbers at the moment, we're seeing people opening even, in the middle of what's happening now. So some of that is coming from on-trade operators that are maybe looking at opening shops in addition to what they're doing already, or sometimes as a replacement, perhaps in the long term. So yeah, the magazine is only about the independent specialists, and it's a smallish number, but it's definitely risen, and we're probably at an all-time high now as far as the market is concerned.
So what is the universe for somebody looking at the UK market wanting to sell into an independent retailer? You're sending your print version or your online version to 900. How many more are there than that? How many independent businesses that actually sell wine with enough seriousness for it not to be just bolted on to everything else they do?
Well, we argue that we've got as near as we can get to 100% of the market. So what we've done is to carefully kind of map it out over the years, and obviously the database is changing several times a week as we kind of assess new information that reaches us. But we think the market is that size. So we've excluded people that would be buying wine from, primarily from cash and carries, for example, who are doing the branded stuff. Nothing wrong with those kind of shops, but that's not what this magazine was intended to be about. So we're talking about people that would be buying from a recognised importer, the big ones being people like Liberty, Alliance and Boudinot, but also much smaller ones as well. And a certain proportion of the audience will be importing their own stuff as well. So we kind of use that as the definition of specialism, but also they have to have, as far as our definition is concerned, they have to have actual physical retail premises. So we're not going to the purely online people. They might do online, they might do a lot of wholesaling as well, but we want people who have got at least some physical retail presence.
So that's an interesting one. And also, in terms of your 900, what about chains that have got 5 or 10 shops versus the one-off?
Well, we don't include odd bins, for example. You could make an argument for odd bins, but we've chosen to not include them on the list because we don't think the business is, it isn't quite as in tune with independents as, people like Tanner's would be on there. So
and would they be one of, so my question is, that are they one of your 900, or is each store included in your 900?
The 928 figure, which it is as we speak, that will count the store numbers. In terms of the number of operators, I think we're up to just under 700 at the moment. So again, these numbers are changing all the time. So sometimes they're as clear as day in my head, and sometimes I've got a kind of an approximation in my head, but that's roughly where we are.
And in terms of what they do you have an idea, because I think you do keep an eye on this, what sort of turnover these businesses actually do a year?
Well, we do quite an in-depth reader survey every year, and it's good because we've now got 8 years worth of data to compare. And you've got to be careful with independents, with any question like that, not to generalize too much, because some people will look at the average figure and say, well, we're nowhere near that. We might be way above it or way under it. But the average last year, or this year, I should say, in the January survey, the average turnover per shop came in at about 550,000, which was slightly down, actually.
Well, yeah, but it's gone up from the 400 a few years ago, I think, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's definitely gone up, but we actually went down a little bit last year. I mean, we trust their data quite a lot, actually, because we get almost 200 businesses take part, so that's a big chunk of the universe. Last year there were pressures on the market, which we all know about, so things were depressed a little bit, but still 550,000 is our mean average. There are obviously people that are turning over a couple of million and sometimes a bit more than that. And also there are some people who seem to survive on very, very tiny figures, either because they've got no outgoings with rent, or they've got, they're in some kind of unit. Increasingly people are using, market type spaces and, lofts of other places, or maybe they're a market store kind of affair. So sometimes the turnover is really tiny, but on average, the mean average is 550,000, and it's kind of been kicking around that neighbourhood for a few years now. So we're waiting for a big kick on from here on in. But yeah, it was down very slightly last year, and the average bottle price that keeps going up, as you'd expect, because of the duty, if nothing else. So that's now up £13.71. So that has been increasing quite comfortably over the last 4 or 5 years, against
the national average of still under 6, isn't it?
Exactly, yeah. So you're talking about a completely different market. So that's the average sales bottle price of a still bottle of wine. So we're not even factoring in the sparkling stuff there, or fortified.
Now, so, in terms of these guys, how much? There's 2 questions, I guess, that one has to look at. One of which is how much of their turnover is spirits, because that obviously would jack the numbers up. Not the average price, because that's a wine price, I believe, but in terms of their 550,000. Any idea how much of that would be spirits?
No, it's going to be, well, we haven't got a quantified figure on that, if I'm absolutely honest with you, Robert. It's a question that we could put into the survey. The reason we haven't perhaps drilled down into that properly yet is that some people will be big specialists on spirits and will skew the figures, and some people don't do any at all. So, I mean, it's going to be less than 10% of most people's turnover. I think the whole gin thing has really made people look at the spirits category in a way they weren't looking at it perhaps a few years ago, and realizing that there is a lot of interest there that will happen almost spontaneously without them even having to do very much kind of to kickstart it. So I think that's been a big driver of it, and there'll be more as people hopefully start to explore other specialisms. So rum is the one everyone talks about. I don't think it will ever get to the kind of the gin kind of status in terms of numbers, but and whiskey as well. I mean, whiskey's a perennial that will keep having its ebbs and flows.
Craft beer.
Craft beers, for some of them, it's been a godsend. I mean, I can think of a few shops where they've actually now they sell probably more craft beer in terms of volume than they do actual wines. I mean, there's certainly one in Edinburgh I'm thinking of where it's gone that route, and that's where they've got more of a kind of perhaps a studenty population around. Again, we haven't got an exact figure of how the breakdown in terms of absolute turnover would compare with wine across the piece. And again, it's possibly just because there's a slight nervousness of them portraying that as the figure that applies to everybody in the independent trade, because the independent trade is so, well, the word is independent, isn't it? And there are so many people doing their own thing, and we try not to get into those generalizations too much. But it's a valid question, and one we'll probably look at more carefully as
there might be 10 or 15% spirits and beer, for example, of the 550.
Yeah, exactly. And in some cases even more. I mean, as I say, there are certainly some people where in terms of volume, there is definitely more beer being sold than wine. I mean, you'd almost say, well, why are those people on your list if they're more beer specialists? But as long as we can see that there's a genuine wine specialist in there at the heart of it, that's good enough for us. And, we don't want people with just the range of, a token range of a couple of dozen wines. We need people that on our list anyway that are genuinely specializing. So they're going to have a range which is typically over 100. And in some cases, much more than that.
So that was my next question. So in terms of an average range for the sort of businesses you're talking about, would you say it's between 100 to 200?
For wine?
Yes.
So I would say on average it would be much higher than that. I mean, there are some people that are in that kind of neck of the woods. Some people, I was talking to a merchant today who's a very good merchant in Glasgow, and his range is about 200 ordinarily, although it's gone up recently. And that's perfectly respectable. I think some people like having that kind of level because they genuinely feel they know those wines inside out, and they're happy selling at that kind of range. I mean, there are people who are well into into four figures, let's put it that way. And people who deal with all kinds of a large number of suppliers. I think a lot of people there's been a kind of trend recently to try and trim things down a little bit in some quarters. Again, I'm trying not to generalize too much, but I think a lot of indies maybe got a little bit unwieldy with their ranges and possibly their supplier roster as well. And there's been a bit of kind of trimming back in some quarters. But having said that, for everyone that speaks to you and says that, there are people who say, do you know what, we might as well have more wines, we might as well have more suppliers, and they've gone the other way. I mean, space is obviously the big kind of consideration for a lot of them, because some of these shops are quite small and storage can be quite limited as well.
So two other questions, and then we'll look at what COVID's done to them. But firstly, how much of these businesses in terms of, so I think of my local indies as a chain of 2 shops in 2 different villages near me. They, I think that probably, I would say 2/3 to 3/4 of their business would traditionally have been wholesale, and the shop is the sort of the retail tail of a wholesale dog. In terms of your 925, how much do you think is of what they do is wholesale and how much is retail?
Well, the reader survey we did in January explicitly asked that question, as it always does. And retail wholesale rather is gradually been tracking down across the market as a whole. And I think there's lots of reasons for that. I think that the market is getting so competitive in some areas, and the margins are lower, and there's a few bad debts can sink a small independent, and that has happened to a few of them over the years. So wholesale at the moment is 16% on average of an independent's turnover. Again, we're generalising. We're talking about this fictitious shop. What these figures are giving us the market as a whole. It just gives us
a broad picture. And in terms, and you said at the beginning that we're not here talking about internet only. That's a separate segment for you. But I'm presuming that all of these guys, or very few of these, will not do online selling. Would that be fair?
It depends how you define selling in a way, because some of them will have transactional websites and some won't. I mean, I think ultimately, if someone places an order by an email, they're going to fulfill it. I mean, but the numbers have traditionally been relatively small. The indies have really underperformed, if I'm honest, with online. The figure is still less than 5% of overall turnover. That's the figure in January. I would imagine that we're going to see, when we ask the same question next January, if the current trends have been sustained, we're going to see a much bigger figure. When I was speaking to a merchant today who didn't do any online sales at all until COVID came along, he started doing stuff selling nationally online about 5 weeks ago, and now he thinks it's probably over 50% of his trade at the moment. And his trade's big. He's not doing a tiny trade. He's doing good business. So I think what's happened is it's really accelerated for a lot of people the kind of the trend towards online sales. So I think a lot of people who were thinking vaguely and abstractly about upgrading their websites are now being forced into doing that. And I've seen some good examples of that recently, where people have they've got a much better transactional website up and running. And so that 5% figure, I think, will go a lot higher. I mean, at the moment, you've got to bear in mind that there are certain things that are not happening for a lot of merchants. I mean, the retail element normally is about 60%. The actual classic shop sales is normally about 60%. Even for those that are open, and doing a bit of social distancing, I can't see sales getting to that kind of level at the moment, unless you include the numbers for local deliveries, which we hadn't explicitly asked about before. So, you know, I think web is going to be huge for people, but they can't do the drinking in is another thing. I mean, 40% of Indies now will have some kind of drinking in element to their trade. And that's been going up for years. It was 37% last year. It went up to 40% this year. And I imagine we're going to get to the point where more than half of independents, or we would have done it had COVID not disrupted everything. We would have got to the point where more than half of Indies will have some kind of wine bar type element to what they're doing. So with that out of the way at the moment, and people not able to do that, and bear in mind the margins are so much better on that kind of stuff than they would be for retail and wholesale. You know, we calculated at the beginning of all this that you'd probably need to see a 50% increase in your retail business, in whatever form you want to term that, online as well as local deliveries, to compensate for what on average you would have picked up on your wholesale business, which in most cases is evaporated. Your ticketed events, which is about 4% of trade as well, which that's been a new development. And obviously your wholesale trade. The drink-in trade. So it's in many cases that's happened. I mean, there's a lot of independents you speak to saying that even though they've lost two of their big revenue streams, sales are actually up and up quite a lot.
Now, the one thing that becomes interesting, the moment they move into a website business, an online business, suddenly they're looking at talking to people who are a lot further away potentially than the neighborhood that they were previously servicing. And that brings in the issues of going on to Wine Searcher and all those sort of things. Is that something that they're all discovering or not yet?
Yeah, I think the interesting thing for me about what's happened recently is, and bearing in mind we've never seen such a big leap. And again, I don't want to generalize too much because there are some independents possibly watching things like this thinking, well, hang on, my sales are down. And there are people who've seen sales that go down. But for those that have seen their sales go up, they're probably looking at this and thinking, well, hang on, we were told that the way to get extra sales was to do all the experiential stuff, to have lots more events, to be communicating with people one-to-one, make it very, very personal, do something that the big boys can't replicate. And now all of a sudden that you're seeing this big leap in sales based on something which is actually pretty impersonal. And in fact, I spoke to one merchant this week who has done extraordinarily good business online by selling branded wine. And it's the kind of stuff he would never dream of having in his shop, but he could see the opportunity for selling the kind of stuff that the supermarkets normally build their business plan around. You know, it was difficult to get to supermarkets. They were running out of wine. They were rationing wine. People didn't want to go to supermarkets, and he saw the opportunity and he cashed in. And you know, that's a real success story for him. And his numbers are crazy. I mean, really, really impressive. For some of them, I think it's an interesting thing because yes, you're right. So much of what happens online is all about the cheapest price. People will just be looking for that. But there's interesting ways of doing that. I mean, there's interesting ways of dealing with that particular issue with cases, for example. So there are people who have been doing things with Whispering Angel, for example. So they make a headline price of Whispering Angel, which is really, really cheap. And that's what people fixate on. And then they will add a little bit, they will bump up the price of the other stuff within that case. So you can do a nice rosé case, a few in there they won't have heard of, make a much bigger margin on that to compensate for almost selling Whispering Angel at cost. So there's been a bit of that happening. And so people are being a bit kind of acute about it. I don't know whether once this all settles down and people are back into normal patterns in their own domestic lives in terms of how they buy things from supermarkets, how they buy their wines, whether that will become a big issue again, because that was always the big barrier for so many people. You know, you've got to invest in your website, you've got to invest in your SEO, you've got to invest in all these things to make the website actually function as you want it to, and make it linked to your own stock holding system and tills and everything, so that you're not kind of flat-footed on that front. And on top of that, you've got to match people on price. And for Indies, that was almost impossible.
Now, are you aware of, I mean, given the fact that we've got all sorts of people now, Bordeaux Chateau, £67 now and so on, doing Zoom tastings, virtual tastings and so on, and restaurants doing that. Are you aware of your Indies getting into that with any great vigor? And secondly, are you seeing a move into them creating wine clubs in a way that they weren't before?
Certainly Zoom tastings for a lot of people have been really successful. We've been reporting on a number of people that are doing those, and I think people have got the hang of it a bit better now. And yeah, I mean, there is this kind of dilemma: how much wine do you actually send out, and are you going to send people a half case to go through, and that's going to be expensive for a lot of people. I don't think everyone has yet worked out how to do the smaller bottles and the kind of argon preservation and things like that. So we're actually going to be writing something about that in the next issue, just to kind of hopefully explain a bit more about how that could work. So for some people, it's been working really well, and I think it's a good way of keeping that kind of community going that so many have built their success around in the independent trade. It's all been about familiar faces, and it's about trusting your local merchant and things like that. In terms of clubs, I mean, I'm not aware that it's accelerated that trend particularly, but there's certainly there are all kinds of types of club, whether they're officially called clubs or whether they're just kind of regular get-togethers, that have always been a hallmark, or in the last 5 or 6 years have certainly been a hallmark of the independent trade. So I think that's continuing. The interesting thing, as you said in the previous question, was quite how you link that kind of stuff to consumers or customers who are perhaps going to be well outside of your own neighbourhood, maybe not even in the same region of the UK as you, and whether. I mean, the guy I was speaking to earlier, who's suddenly found himself with this fan base all across the UK rather than just his local region, he's putting in these very personalised tasting notes that will kind of convey his personality, and they're putting stuff online as well, so in response to what they're getting. So he's getting this kind of dialogue going and this kind of community, if you like. Whether that is going to be something that is enduring, for months and months and years, who knows? I mean, we just don't know how this is all going to pan out, and whether people will think about buying wine in a slightly different way. Maybe they will. I mean, already some buying patterns seem to have changed. I think a lot of people will snap back to the old habits, but the Indies are pretty confident, I think, of hanging on to quite a lot of this new custom.
And then lastly, I think there is, if I was an indie, what might bother me, especially if I was an indie who has a wholesale business as well, what would be bothering me is seeing the wholesalers who are struggling because of their restaurant business and so on, going into direct selling themselves. So we're seeing them, cutting out the middleman by going direct rather than go through the regional retailer as a local wholesaler. They're going direct, or they're actually selling their wine directly to consumers. Are you hearing anything about that from your?
Yeah, there's been a lot of concern about that in some quarters. I think that the key to it is, and it's the same with a lot of things involving importers or stroke suppliers and their independent customers. I think so much of it boils down to communication. And I think as long as people understand what you're doing and it's transparent and no one's being misled, I think the kind of cause for concern diminishes. I mean, there are some perfectly respectable companies. I mean, you pick up people like Graft or maybe Vintage Roots, who do have an arm of their businesses which are selling direct to consumers, and they've had those things for a long time. And people understand it. They understand the rules, and they're not being undercut on price. I think it's where it suddenly comes out of the blue, and people are embarrassed that their own customers are potentially encountering these kind of prices online and thinking that they're being cheated by this, someone who they thought was their local friendly wine merchant. So it has caused some concern. On the other hand, I think there's, everyone's in business, that everyone can see that some of these companies, they've lost, perhaps 75% of their turnover almost at a stroke. And I don't think anyone begrudges them, a little bit of creative thinking to kind of get around that and mitigate for that as best they can. I think what they just don't want is to be kind of thrown under the bus in the process. And that has been how it's been perceived in certain quarters, that the Indies are seen to be expendable because it was always really about the on-trade. The Indies were just a little bit of kind of bunts on top of that. And if they have to disappear or be kind of, as I say, thrown under the bus, so be it. That's the way it's been perceived. I don't think any importer would really put it quite so crudely, obviously, but I think some of it's been a little bit possibly badly managed. But then these people are in crisis mode, and they've got people on furlough. They're having to make quick decisions, and they're trying to save their businesses. And who knows? I mean, by the end of all this, we might find that some of the big names are no longer with us, or have merged, or something else.
And absolutely fine. In terms of what they're selling, I don't know how much you're hearing and seeing of this, but in terms of, for wine producers, if you're trying to sell a natural wine, you're trying to sell a Uruguayan wine or a wine from Croatia or whatever, the restaurants and the indies have been obviously the places you've had to go to, because the supermarkets are not going to be an easy call. what you tend to hear at times of crisis is people go back to the tried and tested, and they go for the brands or the Riojas and the Chablis that they know. On the other hand, we haven't ever had a lockdown before where people have been sitting at home sort of bored and looking for new things to do. Do you have any feeling for what people are buying? Has there been any change in that from your universe?
Yeah, there certainly has. I mean, I think a lot of it has been driven not so much by the buying patterns changing of existing customers. I think it's been this influx of people that have never really bought from independents before. That has changed the landscape quite a lot in some areas. So you're seeing people come in who perhaps have never really explored their local indie before. They might only live around the corner, but they've just never popped their head around the door or engaged with them before. And some of these people, they're not used to spending £13.71 on a bottle of wine as an average price. They're well below that. And so a lot of independents have had to look at their ranges and make some adjustments. And actually, there's been criticism from some of the suppliers saying, well, hang on, why are you, to turn the analogy around, saying, why are you throwing us under the bus now? Because, we're not in that ballpark. We're the kind of £15 plus people. But you can't really blame the Indies if they're getting this influx of custom from people who would normally be buying from a supermarket. Even £9 for some of these people is a big investment on a bottle of wine. They're not used to spending anything like that. I mean, supermarkets have trained people to think that wine is £7. That's a big price to pay for a bottle of wine. So I think some people have used it as an excuse to buy more wine. I haven't heard that many people say that people are spending more per bottle or that those kind of things. I think the volumes have gone up, and I think at the lower end you're hearing a lot more about people spending sort of around about the £10 mark. And there's been a bit of a kind of a quest in some quarters to find more of those wines from independents, because they, some of them only really, that's their entry point, £10, and they've only really had a token selection, some of them, so they've had to engage much more with that end of the market. And it will all depend on how many of those people stick around. If they're still dealing with those people in 6 months' time, then they'll still be selling those kind of wines. But the ambition is to kind of gradually trade them up, obviously.
So your crystal ball, because you're looking at this on a month-by-month basis, but if we were talking in June of next year, and obviously everything's in the air. We don't know what COVID's going to do. We don't know what the economy is going to do. But from what you're saying, the indies are looking probably better than some other sectors at the end of this 3-month period in the UK, in terms of some of the.
Yeah, well, I would say so. I mean, 3 months ago, I wouldn't have dreamt that would have been possible. I thought, we were looking at a real, not quite Armageddon, but I just thought that so many of these businesses, they're not run as massively profitable enterprises, and I could see some of them falling over if there was pressure on them and they couldn't open and people weren't buying. But being allowed to open and finding a ready market, and the weather's been great, and all these other things have all fallen into place. They've done so well. I mean, I've been optimistic about independence for 8 years anyway, and that's why we started the magazine. I could just see that this market was growing and growing and growing, and every year it has. I mean, as I say, there was a bit of a plateau last year, but still the long-term picture has always looked hopeful to me. And the interesting thing over this whole lockdown, if we can still call it a lockdown, is that we haven't seen closures. And I was expecting at least a few of them to go. But, because even in the normal scheme of things, you're going to see a couple go. Just that's the churn in the market. But we haven't really seen that. We've seen a few people kind of all go into a bit of hibernation, but I think they'll be back. Most people have seen that there's some business to be done, and some people have engaged with it less enthusiastically than others. But by and large, I think most people have gone for it. There are exceptions, and the people who are mainly wine bars and with a bit of retail on the side, especially in the bigger cities, some of them are finding it really hard because they're still paying rent, and they're paying rent on zero turnover. So you've got to worry about a few of them. But it's interesting to see how quickly they've adapted in most cases, and I wouldn't be at all surprised to see overall numbers this year be ahead of where they were last year. I mean, we're already up this year. I mean, I think at the beginning of the year it was 920, we're now 928. Over the course of an average year, over the last 8 years, we would normally see a net increase of independents of about 40, something like that, in terms of shop numbers.
And there's a churn rate, presumably, of quite a number close and new ones come up.
Yeah, a lot of the closures are really just down to people retiring, or things like that. You don't hear of that many failures actually, and when you do, I mean, it becomes quite a newsworthy item in a way. But that 40 is a net figure,
Yeah.
So that would account for, perhaps 50 opening and 10 closing, although, those figures are not exact.
And quite a few of those, as you just said, in a way, they're almost hobby businesses, aren't they? They're very low turnover people. It gives them something to do after they've retired in another business sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, some of them are, almost gloriously, I'm not going to say unprofessional, because they're definitely professional, but they're gloriously unbusinesslike, some of them. And, because either they've made their money somewhere else, or their rent and overheads is almost nothing. And they just love the lifestyle. I mean, that's been a bit of a kind of a truism about the independent trade for a long time. I think probably it's becoming more and more outdated by the year. But yeah, I mean, some of them are not making huge money, and they go into the business absolutely knowing that. I mean, we've written about so many people in the last few years who've come in from much more lucrative professions, and just because they love wine. And when you interview them and say, you do realise that no one makes wine and no one makes money in the wine trade particularly, they say, yeah, no, we've heard all of that, but that's not what it's about. And there is a real kind of, to use the dread word, passion. Some of them just have a passion for the subject, and then the industry by extension. So, I think those kind of people will always be around. We can call them hobbyists, or we can just say that they just don't, they're not as ruthlessly businesslike as some people, because they happen to find themselves in a really friendly, gregarious and enjoyable industry. And, that's what independents are about, really.
Graham, thank you very much, and good luck with the next phase of talking to them as they all open their stores, sort of possibly in a bigger way in terms of serving wine and all the other things.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care. So, Mike, first key question: how did you get to be where you are now? Why are you now a wine retailer in Padstow? When did you think that might happen?
Well, we kind of fell into it. Is the honest answer. For those old enough to remember, we did the Victor Cayenne. We liked the company that much, we bought it. So we moved to Cornwall. We, being my wife Mary and I, who's also my business partner now, we moved to Cornwall back in 2007 permanently.
So it's from
we moved from London. So I had settled in London after I left the army. So I left the army in 2000 after a 12-year career that spanned military police, and then I was an infantry officer. I got kind of commissioned midway through and sent to Sandhurst, and so I finished off as a captain in the Royal Irish. I then left and went to work for the London Ambulance Service on sort of disaster management, contingency planning, that sort of thing. The world went crazy with 9/11, so that became quite busy, and then I ended up by hook and by crook. I was ops director for London Ambulance Service, so everything south of the River Thames, and just hit a point where I remember having my annual appraisal with my boss at the time, and he was saying kind things about where the future might land, and I suddenly realised I didn't want it anymore. And I looked at him and how tired and stressed he always looked, and I thought that's the aspiration, that I end up there, and I thought, I just don't want it anymore. What do we do? And by happy coincidence, I met Mary at around the same time, and she dropped off her own career path as well and was looking for something new. And after a bit of a whirlwind romance, we found ourselves fixing up an old Grade 2 listed house that we ran as a bed and breakfast in Padstow. And then if you wind on the clock a few years, we became good customers at Bin 2. And ended up, when we sold our business, I was looking for something to do. I was working a couple of days a week in the wine shop. And after about a year of doing that, the then owner asked us if we'd be interested in buying it. And it was a bit of an impulse decision. We loved the business, so we went for it. And that was, this will be our 7th year now. So
let's rewind. Where did wine fit into your life when you were running the logistics of the ambulance service or being a captain in the army? Or indeed, where did wine fit into Mary? Wasn't in your life at that point, from what I've understood. How did wine fit into her life during that time?
Well, I guess we both like to drink it, but it wasn't something that I would describe as being part of our lives. I've got, if anything, I had a fairly negative view of wine because some of the connotations associated with it, and some associations that were drawn with wine at different points in my career. So I didn't look on it very positively.
Can we come back? I'm not going to let you get away with that, actually, because I think it's the stuff that we don't talk about that we should talk about. What are the negatives? I mean, I can think of lots of negatives, and I think if you're in the ambulance service, you probably think of some health-related negatives. But what were the negatives that you thought of at the time? Because obviously there's still other people maybe still be thinking of those. What were the things that were...
Well, I guess I want to say up front that I know that most of this is in my head, and I'd hate to create a kind of poor me image, but there were times in the military when I was transitioning from being a soldier with no interest in wine at all to being an officer, where as part of that process there was something called a potential officer development course, and it's something the Army had come up with to, as they put it, knock the rough edges off soldiers who were aspiring to be officers. And there were some ridiculous hoops that you went through as part of that that had nothing to do with being an officer, as I subsequently found out. They included going to the ballet and going to the opera. And one of the things that we were made to do was host a wine and cheese party, and it was just excruciating. It was desperately humiliating. We were giving a wine and a cheese each that we had to learn about. And then introduced to a bunch of dignitaries who came around to this wine and cheese party, and I've never felt more like a performing monkey in my life. And it was just deeply humiliating. Everyone in the room knew that we didn't know about it. We knew we didn't know about it. We were mispronouncing it. It was awful. And I guess the memory of that live long. So, and then
can I say, I'm really glad I pressed you on that, because it's the sort of thing that I talk about sometimes, and I talk about snobism and wine and so on. And so often people say, no, you're imagining it. Wine's all lovely and cuddly, and you've just described something that I've seen elsewhere in different ways, and it's certainly something that does exist. And I think that it's relevant that you know about that, because the people who walk into your shop, at least some of them, actually have some of that baggage, I imagine.
I think it's also a huge part of the elitism issues that we deal with in wine, because what you just said is you're looking at moving into an officer space. And what was the set of criteria that they laid before you in what feels to me, as obviously not someone who went to boys' school in the UK, it sounds like the kind of thing that, if you go through fancy private or boarding school, men's school in the UK, that you're going to be taught all of these rites of passage and, this belief of knowledge that's important for navigating the world of what is essentially the elitist white male. So I think that this is powerful in terms of being an empathetic marketer, retailer, communicator. So glad Robert made you say that.
Well, and again, I think I'd like to. The irony is that when I got through the potential officer development course and I went to Sandhurst, I wasn't without my reservations about what I was going to encounter, and I found that irrespective of background, the vast majority of people who were there at Sandhurst were perfectly normal 24-year-olds, as I was at the time. They'd never been to the ballet, the opera. They drank lager like I drank lager. There were a small cohort who might have been through the route that you described, Polly. But I think mostly it was a sort of fairly dated notion on behalf of those who were transitioning soldiers to officers, almost like some sort of, this one's okay because we polished him up a little bit. Don't worry, this one's all right. And I have to say, I didn't really encounter anything, quite that acutely excruciating again. But you're right in as much that the legacy of that has been lasting, because it does drive the way that if there's one message I hammer home to everyone who works for us at Padstow, it's that we're all about making people feel comfortable in this space. The wine bit is entirely secondary. We're all about looking after people, making them feel comfortable. And I'm kind of with you, Robert, and that I still feel intimidated walking into some wine merchants. That's nothing to do with the wine merchant. I think wine is just quite a challenging topic. So we do everything we can to make the space feel warm, comfortable, welcoming, and we have a standing brief that even if it's hurting your soul that someone's dropping an ice cube into that that lovingly chosen Burgundy that we've chilled to the perfect temperature, they drop that ice cube in and we say nothing. That's the way it goes, because someone's already probably feeling a little bit uncomfortable about the act. Why would we make that worse by trying to educate them that maybe you want to try it before putting the ice in? I mean, just don't.
Well, it's interesting. You made the point about the pronunciation that the officers wanted. it is one of the things that is still a huge issue. And people say, you know, there are wines on a wine list that just don't sell because people are nervous of saying it. And Viognier is one of the things that people like us probably take for granted, but it's certainly a hurdle. But so you've now up to a point where you've got a bit interested in wine, but then you was it working at Bin 2 as a sideline that really pushed you over the line into thinking this could be more than casual?
So I suppose it was going there as a customer, and you know, kind of credit to the previous owner who had established Bin 2, and he sort of had started it down the path of it being a hybrid model where you could drink in, you know, before very many people had done that. So that gave us the opportunity to sit in and try more wine. So I guess it was just sort of seeping in through osmosis. I'm a very lazy student. I despise studying or learning about things, but I kind of absorb quite well. So I guess I was absorbing a bit over that time, and like all of us, you know, the more exposure you got, the more interest you have, the more your palate is looking for new things. And then working, but what I really fell in love with the business side really was the social aspect and the, you know, looking after people and playing the host, and you know, without sounding too hokey, creating that kind of warm, welcoming space and seeing how people then respond in that space. That's a bit I you know, really love, and that sort of plays to my strengths more.
So who are your customers? I mean, Padstow, you're a lot of tourists, but you've also got people obviously who live there all year round, and people who live all year round serving tourists. So who do you rely on for your business?
Well, it's a real mix, as you would expect. So we do have regular followers from within the community who live in Padstow year round, but there's no getting away from the fact that we're hugely dependent upon the tourist trade. The thing with Padstow is that it's a very, very long season, and you get an awful lot of repeat visitors. So it's not sort of transitional tourists, if I can put it that way. It's lots of repeat visitors from people who come to Padstow 3 or 4 times a year because the food scene there is so strong now. You reference Rick Stein, but there are other amazing chefs. You know, Paul Ainsworth at number 6. We got, you know, Prawn on the Lawn with, you know, Rick and Katie, and yeah. So there's a lot to draw people there, and so we're hugely dependent on tourism. But it's a very, very long season, and there are a lot of consistent repeat customers who almost feel like they do live there, but they don't. So yeah, so hugely dependent on that.
And in terms, and one of the things that Graham was talking about is how many wine retailers that were not doing much online have moved online in the last 3 months for all the obvious reasons. How much are you selling to people who are not in Padstow? How much?
Well, now a lot more than we were. I'm sorry to say we've not seen the boom that some merchants have around the country, and you know, well done to them. But we're nothing like some merchants I'm in touch with at 200% of turnover. But from a standing start of doing no mail order at all, just wasn't part of our model. You know, we're now about 50-50 split between local delivery and national mail order is achieving about 25% of what we would normally expect to be turning over at this time of year. So not great, but yeah, better than we were, given that it's from a standing start. And if we can hold on to a portion of that, if we can hold on to, you know, even half of it, that'd be a really useful addition to the business moving forward. I guess I've made this mistake of neglecting online. I'd given online a go a couple of times and found it quite hard to crack. So the online shop has sort of fallen into neglect. We were at least lucky that the architecture was there in the website, but we've done nothing really with it in at least a couple of years. So it was a bit of a race to catch up.
So while I desperately want to start asking you questions about the digital side of things, I want to back up for a moment and talk about this experience of buying an ongoing concern, an existing business in wine. So, you know, disclosure, I feel like that you and I, and you particularly, and my husband have had a lot of discussion online where we have a real feel for the personality that's driving Bin 2. And do you feel like when you walked into this going concern, you understood what it took to be financially successful in wine, that you had a platform that was really ready to grow, that the reality met expectations. And I ask this because I think a lot of people go into wine with absolutely zero understanding of what they've just bought.
Yeah, no, that's where we were utterly clueless. So like I say, we bought it on a real whim. I had a pretty good sense for how the business operated, and we had some sort of clear ideas for how we thought we might change it. But no, the learning curve when we got into it was near vertical, and it's still steep. 7 years later, I've got lots of good help around me, but we're continually learning. It sounds like a cliche, but we really are. So no, it was, I'd never been in any form of retail at all. So really simple things like, kind of margins and, and buying smartly and cash flow. It was all, really, very, very new to us. And we bought the business at the worst possible time of the year. We bought it in the middle of January, which is literally when things die in Cornwall for at least 2 months, maybe 3. So it did at least give us a bit of a sort of soft landing in terms of getting our feet under the table. But it was a deathly few months where you just hope the numbers are going to turn around. And also the business was quite heavily associated with the previous owner who'd owned it for 10 years. So there was some degree of anxiety about, to what extent that would have an impact. And we planned conservatively on, takings dropping, sort of fairly dramatically. But in the event they didn't, and we were growing from year one. But yeah, it was an anxious first few months during that, cold, long winter in 2014.
And so now, interestingly, from the watcher's perspective, you have built Bin2 into a space that is such a reflection of your own personality, which is sometimes whimsical or irreverent, or you just don't take wine too seriously. One of the things that we've noticed interviewing people across, 50 some odd sessions is that people who come from outside of wine can set aside a lot of those preconceived notions that the wine industry has. Can you talk to us about the experience of building what is effectively a personality-driven independent? How is that trickled down into your staffing and your hires, your communications?
Well, yeah, not everyone might like seeing my character so much on display, but it's the only way I knew how to do it. So we started out, when we started out, I wasn't on social media at all, and I ignored it and pretended it wasn't there. And eventually a friend who is a social media consultant, bullied me into saying, look, you've got to do something. And I started out doing some kind of formulaic time stuff. And how many a day? How many am I meant to do a day, Sean? What time? And in the end, that just bored the tears off of me. So I just started turning it into as a sort of online outpouring for me. And I guess people responded well to that. Any time I wrote anything about wine, I'd get a like from my sister and my best mate, and oh, well done, bro. Any time I posted something irreverent, challenging, any blogs I did that were halfway amusing, I did something about our dog policy that was interviewing a dog about how dreadful their owners were for letting them muck about in the shop. It's one of the most read things I've ever done. So anything irreverent like that, people seem to respond well to. So I just kind of kept on doing it. And I'm sure occasionally I step over the line, and I definitely shouldn't be allowed on it when I've been drinking too many Negronis. But yeah, I guess we then sort of thought, well, people are liking it, we're all with it, and we used it to try and send out a message that it's a friendly space, it's a fun space, it's not serious, it's not austere. I know there's a row of bottles up against the wall there, but hey, we're having fun with it. You can as well. And it has driven the kind of people who are working with us. So it's driven some of the people who approach us for work have been drawn to the idea that it looks like a fun place to be, which is great. And the collection of people I've got, they are a sort of motley collection of people that I've run into or known over time or bumped into who are just good people, great at looking after people. And I've always said, well, I can't work for you, I don't know anything about wine. I said, don't worry about that. We can layer on the technical knowledge. Don't worry about it. You just come and be yourself in the shop. And You know, don't ever worry about being the most knowledgeable person in the room. If somebody comes in and they start quizzing you about left bank of the Bordeaux versus right bank of the Bordeaux, never be afraid to say, look, actually, it sounds like you know the region better than me. I'll help you as best I can, but, you know, here's what we've got. And yeah, so it does drive the whole kind of character of the place, I suppose. They've all got better personalities than me. They're much better human beings than me, but they are people that I guess are like-minded.
So Angela has just asked a question that directly ties into something I wanted to ask you about. I remember I've seen over the years of communicating with you on social media that you will often use your social spaces to learn and to survey and to make changes on a whim. So maybe about 6 months or a year ago, you went out and you talked about how you organized the shop and what were some ways to do it. I think this was on the heels of the Helen Rosner wine list discussion. So Angela, right. So Angela has just asked, I'm interested to know how the wines are organized to encourage customers to explore based on your own experience. So maybe you can talk not only about the organization of the shop, but also how you use these communities you've built up to ask questions, learn, and try things.
So, so I guess in terms of the organisation of the shelves, we moved over to organising the wines by style rather than by country and region, and that was driven largely just through a few years of observing how people were coming in and asking us for wine recommendations, and it was much more common for somebody to describe a flavour profile that they liked in a wine than it was for them to describe a country and a region. So we thought about organising along those lines. It was also driven by the fact that in the summer we get so busy on the bar sales side of things. We need the shelves to work a bit harder on their own because there are times where we just don't have time to get into the nuance of which wine might suit your preferences and which country and region might you find it. So grouping them together with a simple sort of flavour profile descriptor just signposts to people much more clearly. And as a byline, I was really keen to make sure that some of the interesting wines we found from lesser known regions didn't stay in their dusty corner, neglected by people. So by organising by style, it means that we've got a Sertico from Greece. It's a fantastic wine. Never used to sell any of it because it's up in the same sort of space as Chablis now, and we can hook in the whole kind of like, oh no, there's a Chablis of Greece, blah blah blah. People see it then next to the Chablis, and they'll either say, well, I'll give that a whirl instead, or they grab a Chablis and say, well, I'll try this one as well. And so it's brought out some of those wines that I like and enjoy. My taste tend towards the quirky. It's brought them sort of front and centre, rather than languishing somewhere in the corner. So likewise, Greece again, Zina Mavro, it's living up there next to Pinot Noirs, and people are like, oh, I'll give that a whirl, in a way that they never would if they saw this weird to pronounce wine that's sat in a country that they may not immediately leap towards. And we've had a really, really good response to that. I mean, the acid test for me was with those kind of customers that I've described like it, and it seems to work for them. But the real test was that first time we do get someone with real wine knowledge in, and they stop, and it's like, this is really unfamiliar. Will they be able to find their way to the wine they're expecting? So will they know where to look for that Burgundy they're looking for? And invariably, so far, the answer's been yes. So fingers crossed, thumbs up so far.
So how many wines do you? How many different wines do you have on your shelves?
How many different wines?
Well, how many SKUs, as you might say? I mean, what's your range of wines?
Oh crikey! So off the top of my head, maybe 300, 350, something like that. We've been pulling the range in a bit as well to kind of keep it a bit more tightly focused, and we were trying to bring in a bit more rotation as well, because I think I've rambled on and I've forgotten the question you asked, Polly, but you asked something about how we feature the wines that we're enthused about. So we've been experimenting more and more with the kind of scarcity effects. I'm a keen reader of Joe Fattorini's columns on how to sell wine, and on the back of that I read a book by Phil Barden called Decoded, the art of how you sell things, and there are just a few things in there that we played with, and the scarcity effect works well. So we find a wine that we're enthused about. It'll either be something that we shipped in ourselves, or it'll be something that's genuinely short in short in quantity, and we do it on the basis of here's something great. When it's gone, it's gone, and we do some features on that. We've introduced meet the winemaker sections. So again, it's trying to learn a little bit from what naked wines do well. They do create the impression of a connection between customer and winemaker. So we introduced some feature spaces in the shop with a picture of the winemaker, one paragraph that I put together trying to sum up what their story was, and then featuring their wines, and that's worked quite well. So I guess that's how we try and sort of put stuff we like front and center and bring people's attention to it.
I think it's very interesting, because I've judged over a great many years Wine Merchant of the Year competitions. I used to do an annual guide every year where I had to do it annually for years. And to me, it was the most tedious task, because essentially with other judges, all you did was say, oh yeah, well, they've got 500 wines and they've got 800 wines, and they must be better because they've got 1,000 wines, and oh, they must be brilliant because they, and you just think, well, why is more better necessarily?
I don't think it is. It's not. It's not at all.
And then I kept meeting people who were frightened of wine shops, and even Oddbins back in the day in the UK, which was every wine person's favorite chain, was still daunting to people, because you go in and it's full of stuff you don't know what to do with and don't know how to pronounce and so on. And the more bottles there are, the more daunting it is. So I like these things you're talking about, where essentially there are elements that take your eye, like the photograph or the picture of the winemaker and the stories and the range. And in terms of what you buy, you're buying presumably from the traditional merchants and importers that everybody else buys from, but you're also bringing in your own wine, and I believe, and you've got some wines that are exclusive to you. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean that's quite new for us, and I've enjoyed it enormously. It's not a huge part of what we do. It was new really for 2019. I guess we did have a bit of a track record in trying to, there was the odd winemaker that I worked with directly where we really got behind and showcased their wine. So there's a good friend of mine who is a Cornishman who's a winemaker in Bordeaux called Shadow Sivrak, and we bought some of his wine and co-branded it. It was the first vineyard I'd visited as a wine shop owner, and we tasted this wine in barrel that was nowhere near ready, and I said, let me know when it's ready, as a throwaway remark. And a couple of years later he said it's good to go, and I said, well, how much have you got? And he said, well, 1 barrel. I said, well, look, why don't I take all of it and we'll co-brand it. And that was our first Jammy Git wine, which is our ludicrously named own brand label, which is meant to be a kind of playful nod at how lucky we are to be in the trade. And he was horrified, bless him. He was horrified that I was going to take his lovely Bordeaux and stick this Jammy Git label on it. But I theorised that people can pronounce it. It's a little bit of humour in an area of retail where humour isn't widely used. There's another lesson from that Phil Barden book that people like faces, they associate with faces. So it had a caricature, a very flattering caricature, made good graphic designer. And I am the Jammy Git. I'm lucky I found this one and just stumbled on it. And we stuck it on the shelf to see how it would do. And the eye-catching label, the fact that people could just say Jammy Git, the fact that it raised a little bit of a laugh, or Bob's a Jammy Git, buy a bottle for him, it kind of worked. So we've spun off with that, and we've done a couple more collaborations that have been Jammy Git collaborations, and we've made our own wine with a local winery, a Pet Nats, which we called Fizzy Bum Bum, much to the horror again of many people around me. But we've sold out of that during a global pandemic and lockdown. It's all gone before I got a chance to pour a glass.
How much of that did you make?
Not a huge amount. We made 300 bottles.
Mm-hmm.
So because we're completely uncertain about how it would turn out, we've never made wine before. Completely uncertain about how people would respond to Pet Nat, which they're often not familiar with. We left it unfiltered, so it was really cloudy because we were convinced that it was the better wine for it. But again, didn't know how people would respond to it. And in the event, people have been absolutely fantastic, and they've liked the humour of the branding. I think people are now at a place where they they like coming along for the ride, and when we're doing something daft, it's like, oh, you know, give me a piece of that. Come on, what are you doing now? So I'm sure there have been some sort of sympathetic support purchases, but we've had lots of reorders and lots of people saying nice things about it. So the bad news is it's given me more and more confidence for other projects.
Now, I'm interested to know your Sorry.
So one thing about Fizzy Bum Bum that we watched roll out that I thought was...
I just wanted to hear you say it.
I know. I love it. It's been on my list of questions for you. Is that you made a packaging decision about Fizzy Bum Bum that was, I can't say it with English accent. It really loses something with the American accent. But you made this packaging and presentation decision that ended up being fabulous, like much lauded for protecting the wine, but also in the context of you've got a cloudy pet nat in this bottle, yada, yada. So can you talk to us? I mean, Robert can tell you from his work with Stranger and Stranger, we can tell you from doing labels, there's a lot of time and money and focus group and effort that goes into packaging. And here you guys rocked out with this pet nat, you did this thing exactly right, people loved it, it got written up all over the place. What was your process in making those decisions?
Well, I guess the sort of creative process in terms of what are we going to call it, it is that extension of personality have been to, I suppose. I mean, we can't, having launched a wine called Jammy Git, there was much debate over what we should call our pet nat. And I said, look, you know, our first project was Jammy Git. We can't name it after some indigenous flower. I mean, you know, come on. So it was always going to be a projection of personality, and something, frankly, commercially, something that catches people's eye on the shelf. You know, you see Fizzy Bum Bum on the shelf. Even if your response is horror, you're going to have a response. So it was a projection of personality. In terms of getting the branding right, we're really lucky that there's a good friend of ours who is a proper, authentically trained designer. He's not a guy who's a bit handy with a bit of software he's bought. He's a proper trained designer, and he takes the stuff in my head and turns it into design, and then he goes through the frustrating process of me saying, why don't we do a bit of this, bit of that, bit of this, bit of that, and he'll do a couple of options for me that are based on my suggestions, and we'll agree that my suggestions are rubbish, and we'll go back to what he proposed at the beginning. So it's always been really important to me to, if you're going to call a wine something ridiculous and humorous, it's got to look great. So we've always spent money on the packaging. I think not investing in your branding and your labeling is a fool's errand. Yeah, people buy with their eyes, they just do. There's no point denying it. So yeah, we invest money in getting that right. And you said something earlier, Polly, about us not taking wine too seriously, and you're right in a sense. But if I can just throw in a bit of nuance, we do take the wine seriously. We just don't revere it. So with the pet nat, we knew that people who are buying rosé like to see the rosé colour. I also knew with my many conversations with Brad from English wine producer. I'm so sorry, Brad. I can't remember where you're from now.
Timber.
Yeah. So Brad is very active on Light Strike, and I learned about Light Strike from him. So I knew we had to protect the wine, but still wanted people to be able to see the paint. So that's what took us down the paper wrap route, and also it's quite a cost-effective way of doing labelling on a small run. So it was a sort of mashup of eye-catching design. It was the right thing to do to protect the wine, and the right thing to do to sort of respect the wine, and it gave us a big platform to do some eye-catching branding. It enabled us to tell the story, and it makes it pop, you know, on the shelf. So that was the rationale behind it. Can
I move from the product to the people for a second? In the sense of, and this always fascinates me, because I know people who buy all their meat from the local butcher, all their vegetables from the local greengrocer. On the other hand, I know other people who will actually be at a greengrocer, they'll be in a posh Waitrose, and they'll go to Lidl because Lidl's vegetables are incredibly cheap and they're good, and they'll spread across the range. In terms of your customers, do you know what else they do? I mean, how many of them do you think get most of their wine from you? How many of them are actually down the supermarket most of the time, get their special bottles from you? Do you know much about this stuff in terms of your customers?
I mean, Polly's going to be horrified. Don't look disgusted with me, Holly. But our intelligence on stuff like that is appalling. I don't know. I can only tell you what I think intuitively is that, and it's probably because we had nudged ourselves more and more down the hybrid route. People come to us and they look for something interesting and exciting they can try by the glass, and they come to us when they're treating themselves. But they're probably not buying their staple wines from us. And if I'm honest, I think what I learned during the lockdown and the way in which we had to sort of redirect things is that our range probably did reflect the fact that most of our wines we're introducing to people in the shop. Most of our wines people get a chance to try a drop by the glass, either because we've already got it open by the glass, or because I say, hey, look, I'll pop it open, have a taste. If you don't like it, I'll take it home for dinner myself tonight. So my intuitive feeling is that most people are coming to us for an enjoyable drinking. They're buying bottles that are a bit of a treat, but they're probably buying their staple wine elsewhere. We have during lockdown picked up, and this has been really heartening, we picked up some new local trade, some from names that I don't recognise and some from names that I do recognise but who probably don't use as often, who have been routinely placing repeat orders for our more entry level wines, which are great wines in themselves. But it's been a bit of a sort of wake up call for me that maybe I could have neglected a sector that I need to pay a bit more attention to going forward to try and kind of keep hold of that.
Is your average price, Graham was talking about the average price of about £13 in the Indies, which is, I think, more than double the average price for the rest of the country in retail. Are you in that sort of ballpark?
We're probably up from that, if I'm perfectly honest. So we're probably up somewhere to sort of 15 to 18, and I think that the rationale has been because of our model for the way we do wines by the glass, we don't charge much additional margin for that. What I've always really enjoyed about our wine by the glass menu is that you're getting a really, really, really great wine for an equivalent price that you pay somewhere else that's applying 70% margin to it. So our retail price of the wines is probably higher than normal, because most of our wines we're punching out by the glass at a price that sort of makes sense with slightly less margin than people are normally paying in a restaurant or bar, if that makes sense. But the whole process of reorganising the wines by style opened up some gaps in our shelves that when I looked at them, it's like, crikey, that really exposes my preferences. And then I think the pandemic has highlighted some gaps in our range in terms of pricing, and we need to think about what we do about that while still retaining the things about us that people seem to like and enjoy.
And category management, there's awful expressions, but it is one that is interests me, because you've got these 300 wines on your shelf, whatever the number is. How many of the people who come in to sell you wine actually look at what you've got and understand where what they're trying to sell you might fit? And how many come in and say, hey, I've got this brilliant, pet nat, whatever, and actually you might not need another pet nat because you've got 3 pet nats already, and that's not a gap. How sophisticated are the people who come in to sell you wine?
Most of my suppliers fit into the former. They know us well, and they know now to think about what they're introducing to us. I don't want to sound like a massive ass, but people have just learned over time that there's no point turning up with your special that you need to push that month because you've bought too much of it, because we don't buy it. And again, because we don't do any wholesale at all, we're not somewhere that a supplier can turn up to and say, hey, look, we got this, it's all right, it's not great, but it's a really keen price and you can push it out to restaurants and bars. We just don't do that. So and I think we're quite lucky that perhaps because the reps, like a trip to Padstow, who wouldn't, they look after us well, and I think they target what they put in front of us quite carefully, playing to what they think we're likely to buy. So I'm really, really lucky in that respect. The only couple of kind of large national suppliers we've had who behaved otherwise, we no longer work with, just because it became a bit too tedious. And increasingly, I'm enjoying working with smaller suppliers who are sort of like-minded. I've got a bit of a noble cause in mind that I don't know if we're going to be able to deliver this year, but I'm going to try. That increasingly we're going to develop a buying matrix for the shop. So I want to make sure my mantra going forward this year. It's a time of reinvention, isn't it? A time of reinvention, and we've been leaning this way anyway. But my mantra this year is I want to be buying good wines that are made sustainably by good people. So I've not yet been able to find a matrix that mashes together environmental sustainability and social ethics on behalf of the person who's made it. So we're going to make one up ourselves, and we're going to be looking for wines that fit into that matrix. And if we can't find them ourselves, we'll be giving that to our suppliers, saying, "Here are the kind of wines that we're buying now. Come and demonstrate to us that the wine you're introducing can fit into this matrix. We've only got 250 slots on the shelves. You've got 2,000 wines on your portfolio. You must have some that meet the criteria that they're good wines, made sustainably by good people, and that's what we're going to sell."
I love the fact you're doing that, but I'm going to, and Polly, you've got a question. I was going to throw in quickly. How much of that is you, and how much of that is your customers? How many of your customers do you think? Because everybody says they care about sustainability, and they say they care about low alcohol. They say they care about all sorts of stuff. When they go into the shops, they buy the 14% alcohol, non-sustainable wine quite often. But maybe you've got customers who actually do fit the model.
Well, on the off chance that any of them have tuned in, of course they do. They're all great, and they're all thoroughly on mission with this. But I think the reality is probably not. But my rationale is I don't have to make that a sort of Messiah-like mission statement for them. But what I can do is I can be satisfied that I'm buying in line with those principles. And like I say, I've only got 250 slots. It shouldn't be too much of a challenge to find 250 wines that meet those criteria. And the fact that they then meet those criteria can become part of the story of that wine. But I don't need to get on a soapbox and bore people rigid with it. They can be buying well without necessarily knowing they're buying well unless they show an interest. But I think it had just become part of the story. People have responded well to it's cliche, isn't it? But people have responded well to the story of us finding wines, of us finding something that's exclusive, of us championing a little guy. So I don't know, we'll see how it goes, but that's the plan anyway.
All I was going to say is, and here you are given a space where this is going to go up on YouTube, and YouTube has lots of opinions. So everybody who's watching it can share their recommendations for wines who meet your 2020 and beyond criteria, and we'll just forward all of those to you.
Absolutely.
I do want to say something that I feel like we have been remiss, because when we asked you to join us tonight, and it was because we've had conversations, what we didn't do is we didn't ask Mary to join us tonight. And I think that was a failing on our part, because as you say, Mary has been there from the get-go. She's your business partner. And I know from discussions that you guys do really work this business together. This is not trying to get into your personal life, but owning and running a business with family, with people you love, is challenging. It is also a part of the wine industry. So if there are any lessons or takeaways that you might be willing to share with us about how we communicate, how we lay out business planning versus, you've got children. What do you talk about at the dinner table? Is it all about bin 2? Is it about the life beyond wine? The things that are the real, meaningful life stories of being a part of the wine industry.
Well, first off, don't feel too bad, because Mary wouldn't have come on screen. She's a famous introvert, and she's perfectly happy for me to do this. But you're right, she is an integral part of everything that goes on. I guess we're incredibly lucky that when we met, we were both up for a new adventure. So I guess we knew that about each other, that we're kind of risk takers. If there's one sort of thing I allow myself to say that Mary and I do well, it is we did give things a go. Why not? I think we both live by the mantra of better to regret the things you've done than regret the things you've not done. So I think the first lesson would be having someone who's got a sort of corresponding attitude to risk, because if Mary and I didn't, I think that could be really be difficult. And the second thing that helps is that whilst I am like I'm like an annoying playful Labrador, it's kind of like, oh, idea, why don't we do this? Oh wow, another idea, we do this. Mary is a real detailed thinker, and in the early days we kind of rubbed up against each other, because Mary would get a bit overwhelmed by my ideas and energy, and would sort of try and calm them down too soon. She wouldn't let me spend my energy, and she'd immediately start thinking about all the problems we need to solve. And so I'd say that, oh, you're killing the idea, blah blah blah. But we just settled in a place where we recognised that both are good, and as long as you make room for each other, you end up at the right answer. So Mary now lets me get all my ideas out, and she'll listen and go, yeah, no, great, that's a great idea, it's a great idea. And then she'll let me spend all my kind of like, yeah, this energy, and then she'll start talking about, here are some of the things we need to think about to make that happen. And she probably subtly kills off about 7 ideas out of 10 through her practical way of thinking. But then
so she and your label designer are actually probably fully attuned. We're very coming up to time. I'm very aware of this. I've really enjoyed this conversation. But where does, I'm interested, you don't do wholesaling, which a lot of people do. And it's an interesting time because some of the wholesalers are now moving into parking their tanks on your lawn by selling directly in all sorts of ways. If you look ahead for the next, and obviously everything's unknown with COVID and whatever the financial world we're going to go into, but what do you see the next stage, next chapter in Bin 2 being? More wines, more private label wines, more, we give another shot? Where might you go from here? Well, Mary will obviously probably say no, but where might you?
Well, to give her again, I feel like I must say that the 3 ideas out of 10 that she says actually they're goers, she then fully gets behind and she helps deliver them because she thinks about all the details that I would otherwise forget. So I think for us, I think because I enjoy projects and people who follow us seem to enjoy those projects and then buy the product of those projects, and I'm not blind to the fact that it seems to be quite good for marketing and in terms of raising our profile. So if so it's a sweet spot, isn't it? It's something I enjoy doing. People respond well to it. They like the product, and it's good for marketing. So we'll be doing more of that, because we have got a following now who are saying, so what's next? So what's next? When's it coming? I think I don't think we're going to change anything dramatically. I don't see myself getting into wholesale. It always looks really painful whenever I speak to people who are doing wholesale properly, and I'm absolutely convinced it's something you've got to do wholeheartedly or not at all. So we do a little bit with restaurants who want to buy the kind of wines that I described earlier, and I'd be interested in looking for more opportunities to do that. Something we've tried already that I'm keen to see if we can do more of is more working with really nice little delis and places that are selling some wines but maybe don't have access to very many good wines or don't have wine knowledge in house. So we had trialed a concept called Bin 2 at the and then insert the name of the other business. So the first one we did is Bin 2 at the Ark. We happen to own the Ark, but we introduced a Bin 2 branded section into that food shop and deli that my wife owns and runs, and through having not doing any additional training for the staff, our theory was we're sort of lending the Bin 2 brand to it. We're giving a degree of confidence about the wines, and we write some easy to follow notes, and we put a tight selection of about 40 well-chosen wines in there. And wine sales went up over the course of a year from about 10% of turnover to 30% of turnover. Wow. And we're now, we've got a second venue now, another deli where we've done that. We've got another business that's approached us to ask to work in partnership like that. So I'm kind of seeing that as a way in which we can expand, but without any of the risk of additional premises. And I suppose that's kind of sort of wholesale, isn't it? But it's with a selected range rather than negotiating over 10p on a bottle of house white. So I'd like to see if we can sort of spin that out and do more with the bin to at the model. And I guess that's about it, really.
Well, thank you, Mike. I think we'd love to come back and continue the conversation in a future time and actually see how that's all evolving and the next Fizzy Bum Bum, whatever follows that, or indeed the next venture of it. Thank you very much for your time. And I'm looking forward to seeing this go online next week. And as Polly said, we will invite people to come up with some of their suggestions for what you may have. Enjoy your weekend. Stay safe.